Thank you very much. I'm very honored and delighted to be here this afternoon. And I want to thank the Nobel Museum for their generosity and hospitality. I'm hoping to offer you a set of thoughts on ethical obligations that are global in character and that emerge at a distance and also within relations of proximity. The two questions that concern me are at first quite different from one another. The first is whether any of us has the capacity or inclination to respond ethically to suffering at a distance, and what makes that ethical encounter possible when it does take place. The second is what it means for our ethical obligations when we are up against another person or group, find ourselves invariably joined to those we never chose. This happens at the border of several contested states, but also in various moments of geographical proximity, what we might call up againstness, the result of populations living in conditions of unwilled adjacency, the result of forced emigration, or the redrawings of the boundaries of a nation state. Of course, presumptions about farness and nearness are already there in most of the accounts of ethics that we know. There are communitarians who do not mind the local, provisional, and sometimes nationalist character of the communities to which they consider themselves ethically bound, and whose specific community norms are treated as ethically binding. They valorize nearness as a condition for encountering and knowing the other, and so tend to figure ethical relations as binding upon those whose face we can see, whose name we can know and pronounce, those we can already recognize and whose form and face is familiar. It is often assumed that proximity also imposes certain immediate demands for honoring principles of bodily integrity, nonviolence, and territorial or property rights claims. And yet it seems to me that something different is happening when one part of the globe rises up in moral outrage against actions and events that happen in another part of the globe, a form of moral outrage that does not depend upon a shared language or a common life grounded in physical proximity. In such cases, we are seeing and enacting the bonds of solidarity that emerge across space and time. Now, these are times when, in spite of ourselves and quite apart from any intentional action of our own, we're nevertheless solicited by images of distant suffering in ways that compel our concern and move us to act, to voice our objection and register our resistance to such violence through political means. In this way, we might say that we do not merely or only receive information from the media about faraway places, on the basis of which we as individuals then decide to act or not to act. We do not only consume such information, we're not only paralyzed by the surfeit of the images, sometimes, not all times, but sometimes the images that are imposed upon us operate as an ethical solicitation. And I want for the moment to call attention to this formulation, since I'm trying to underscore that something sometimes impinges upon us at a distance without our being able to anticipate or prepare for it in advance. And this means that we are in such moments affronted by something beyond our will, not of our making, that comes to us from the outside as an imposition, but also as an ethical demand. I want to suggest that these are ethical obligations which do not quite require our consent, and neither are they the result of contracts or agreements into which any of us have deliberately entered. To make this view plain, I want to suggest as a point of departure that sometimes images and accounts of war suffering are a particular form of ethical solicitation, one that compels us to negotiate questions of proximity and distance. They do implicitly formulate ethical quandaries. Is what is happening so far away from me that I can bear no responsibility for it? Is what is happening so close to me that I cannot bear having to take responsibility for it? Is what is happening, if I myself did not make what is happening, this suffering that is happening, am I still in some other sense responsible to it? How do we approach these questions? Although what I have to offer this afternoon and evening will not be focused on photographs or images, I want to suggest that the ethical solicitation that we encounter in, say, the photograph of war suffering, brings up larger questions about what ethical obligation is and how it is conveyed. After all, we do not always choose to see images of war, or violence, or death. They may appear on our screen, we may flash upon them, or they may flash upon us as we walk down the street by the kiosks where newspapers are sold. We can click on a site as a deliberate act in order to get the news, but that does not mean that we are actually prepared for what we see or that we have really consented to see it. We understand what it means to be overloaded or overwhelmed with sensory images, but are we also ethically overwhelmed at such instances? And would it be a problem if we were not? I've made the point elsewhere that Susan Sontag considered that war photography overwhelms and paralyzes us at the same time. She thought we were paralyzed from acting, that we couldn't rely on those images to incite political mobilization, deliberation, resistance to the unjust character of state violence and war. But is it possible to be overwhelmed and unparalyzed? And can we understand this as the working of an ethical obligation upon our sensibilities? Must we, in fact, be overwhelmed to some degree in order to have a motivation for action? We only act when we're moved to act, and we are moved by something that affects us from the outside, from elsewhere, from the lives of others, imposing a surfeit that we act from, a surfeit that we act upon. According to such a view of ethical obligation, receptivity is not only a condition for action, but it is one of its constituent features. The media names any mode of presentation that relays to us some version of reality from the outside, that impinges on us, making it possible to register a reality, and so to be moved by it toward some responsive action. In this sense, ethical obligation imposes itself upon us without actually getting our consent in advance, suggesting that consent is not a sufficient condition for delimiting the global obligations which constitute our responsibility. My second point is that ethical obligations emerge not only in the context of established communities that are gathered within borders, speak the same language, and constitute a nation. Obligations to those who are far away as well as to those who are proximate cross linguistic and national boundaries. They are only possible by virtue of visual or linguistic translations. These confound any communitarian basis for delimiting the global obligations that we have. So neither consent nor communitarianism justify or delimit the range of obligations that I seek to address here today. I think this is probably an experience we have in relation to the media when it makes suffering at a distance suddenly proximate and makes what is proximate appear very far away. My own thesis is that the kind of ethical demands that emerge through the global circuits in these times depend on this reversibility of proximity and distance. Indeed, I want to suggest that certain bonds are actually wrought through this very reversibility between proximity and distance. If I'm only bound to those who are close to me, already familiar, then my ethics are invariably parochial, communitarian, and exclusionary. If I'm only bound to those who are human in the abstract, then I avert every effort to translate culturally between my own such situation and that of another. I circumvent the problem of translation for global responsibility. If I'm only bound to those who suffer at a distance, but never bound to those who are near me, then I evacuate my situation in an effort to secure the distance that allows me to entertain ethical feeling. But if ethical relations are mediated, and I use this Hegelian word with its resonance with media, if ethical relations are mediated, if they have to pass through some translation, pass through some presentation, then it follows, I think, that what is happening there also happens in some sense here, and if what is happening there depends on the event being registered in several elsewheres, then it would seem that the ethical claim of the event takes place always in a here and a there that are fundamentally bound to one another. In one sense, the event is always emphatically local, since it's precisely the people there whose bodies are on the line. But if those bodies on the line are not registered elsewhere, there is no global response and also no global form of ethical recognition and connection. Something of the reality of the event is actually lost. And it's not just that one discrete population views another at certain media moments, but that such a response makes evident a form of global connectedness, however provisional, with those whose lives and actions are registered in that way. In short, to be unprepared for the media image that overwhelms can lead not to paralysis, but rather to a situation of being moved, and so acting precisely by virtue of being acted upon, and being at once there and here, and in different ways, accepting and negotiating the multi-locality of ethical connections we might rightly call global. Can we then turn to some versions of ethical philosophy in order to reformulate what it means to register an ethical demand during these times that is reducible neither to consent nor to established agreement, and that takes us outside of established community bonds? I will then consider briefly some arguments by Emmanuel Levinas and Hannah Arendt on these vexed relations that hold among ethics proximity and distance, as I seek to articulate a version of cohabitation that follows from the account of ethical obligation I am describing here today. Both of these thinkers offer views that are both illuminating and problematic. So I'll be elaborating their views for my own purpose, but I'll also be showing exactly where I must break with them. In order to make matters finally more politically concrete, I hope to turn to the example of Palestine-Israel toward the end of my remarks, when I hope it will be possible to understand from these two Jewish thinkers an alternative view of cohabitation, one that is at a critical distance from the view of Jewish politics that is elaborated by the Israeli state, by contemporary versions of political Zionism and its allegiance to settler colonialism. But you'll have to wait a little while before I get there. There are two dissonant dimensions of Levinas's ethical philosophy. On the one hand, there's the importance of the category of proximity to his idea of ethical relations. Indeed, it seems that the ways that others act upon us without our will, prior to our will, constitutes the occasion of an ethical appeal or solicitation. This means we are acted on and solicited ethically prior to any clear sense of choice. To be impinged upon by another assumes a bodily proximity, and it's the face that acts upon us, and we are to a certain extent affected and claimed by that face at the same time. On the other hand, our ethical obligations extend to those who are not proximate in any physical sense and do not have to be part of a recognizable community to which we both belong. Indeed, for Levinas, those who act upon us are clearly other to us, and necessarily so, and it is precisely not by virtue of their sameness that we are bound to them. Okay, at least this is the explicit proposition he makes in his ethical philosophy. Whether or not he turns out to subscribe to that consistently will be a second question we'll turn to in a moment. Indeed, Levinas sustains some contradictory views on this question of the otherness of the other, who makes an ethical claim on me. He clearly affirmed forms of nationalism, especially Israeli nationalism. He also held to the notion, very controversial, that only within a Judeo-Christian tradition were ethical relations possible. But let us for the moment read him against himself, or read him for the political possibilities he opens up, even those he never intended, even those he would explicitly refute. Levinas's position, his ethical position, allows us the following conclusion: that the set of ethical values by which one population is bound to another in no way depends on those two populations bearing similar marks of national, cultural, religious, or racial belonging. It's interesting that Levinas insists that we're bound to those we do not know, and even those we did not choose, could never have chosen, and that these obligations are, strictly speaking, pre-contractual, prior to any deliberately entered into agreement. And yet he was the one who famously claimed in an interview that the Palestinian had no face, and that he only meant to extend ethical obligations to those who were bound together by his version of Judeo-Christian and classical Greek origins. In some ways, he gave us the very principle that he betrayed, and this means that anyone and everyone is not only free, but obligated to extend that principle to the Palestinian people, even though Levinas could not, or precisely because Levinas could not. His failure directly contradicts his formulation of the demand to be ethically responsive to those who exceed our immediate sphere of belonging, but to whom we belong nevertheless, regardless of any question of what we choose or by what existing agreements we are bound, or indeed by what established forms of cultural belonging are available. Of course, this raises a question of how there can be an ethical relation to those who cannot appear within the horizon of ethics, who are not rightly considered persons, or who are not considered to be the kind of beings with whom one can or must enter into an ethical relation. Here is where a most painful division within Levinas's work continues to haunt those of us who seek ethical resources there. On the one hand, he tells us that we're claimed by others, including those we've never known, those we still don't know, that we're born into this situation of being compelled to honor the life of the other, every other, whose claim on life comes before our own, which is more important than self-preservation. On the other hand, he claims that this very ethical relation depends upon a specific set of religious and cultural conditions, Judeo-Christian, and that those who are not formed within this tradition are not prepared for ethical life and are not included as those who can make a claim upon those who belong to a narrow conception of the Judeo-Christian West. It's an agonizing contradiction at the heart of Levinas's writing. Is it possible to take the ethical philosophy formulated there, deploy it against the very exclusionary assumptions by which it is sometimes supported, and do something else with it? Can we use Levinas against himself to help in the articulation of a global ethics that would extend beyond the religious and cultural communities that he saw as its necessary limit? Let's take as an example his argument that ethical relations are asymmetrical. The other has priority over me. What does that concretely mean? Does the other not have the same obligation toward me? Why should I be obligated toward another who does not reciprocate in the same way toward me? For Levinas, reciprocity cannot be the basis of ethics, since ethics is not a bargain. It cannot be the case that my ethical relation to another is contingent on that other's ethical relation to me, since that would make my ethical relation less than absolute and binding. It would establish my self-preservation as a distinct and bounded sort of being as more primary than any relation I have to another, which means that in the name of self-preservation, I can do anything to the other. Right? If self-preservation comes first, then any ethical obligation to the other is suspendable by virtue of recourse to self-preservation. Interestingly enough, this is the position that Levinas opposes. No ethics, in his view, can be derived from egoism or from self-preservation. Egoism is, in his view, the defeat of ethics itself. I take a little distance from Levinas here, even though I find it a fascinating position. I agree in the refutation of the primacy of self-preservation for ethical thinking, but I want to insist upon a certain intertwinement between that other life, all those other lives, and my own, one that is irreducible to national belonging or communitarian affiliation. In my view, which is surely not mine alone, the life of the other, the life that is not my own or our own, is also my life or our life, since whatever sense our life has is derived precisely from this sociality, this being already and from the start dependent on a world of others, constituted in and by a social world, and I would add, a social world sustained by a living environment. In this way, there are surely others distinct from me whose ethical claim upon me is irreducible to an egoistic calculation on my part. But that is because we are, however distinct, also bound to one another. And this is not always a happy or felicitous experience. To find that one's life is also the life of the other, or the life of others, even as this life is distinct and must be distinct, means that one's own personal individual boundary is at once a limit and a site of adjacency, a mode of spatial and temporal nearness and even boundedness. Moreover, the bounded and living appearance of the body is the condition of being exposed to the other, exposed to what I'm calling ethical solicitation, exposed also to seduction, passion, injury, exposed in ways that allow us to be sustained, but also in ways that can destroy us. In this sense, and here I will give you a little preview of what's to come, the exposure of the body upon which Levinas's position depends points to its precariousness, although that's not really the word he uses. At the same time, for Levinas, this precarious and corporeal being is responsible for the life of the other, which means that no matter how much one fears for one's own life, no matter how urgent the question of self-preservation becomes, preserving the life of the other is paramount. We might say, if only the Israeli army felt this way. Indeed, this is a form of responsibility that's not easy, since it emerges precisely from a felt sense of precarity. Precarity names both the necessity and difficulty of this kind of ethics. It's surely hard to feel at once vulnerable to destruction by the other and yet responsible for the other. And readers of Levinas object all the time to his formulation that we are, all of us, in some sense, responsible for that which persecutes us. And he uses this word persecution with all its terrible resonance. He does not mean by this that we bring about our persecution, or that we brought persecution on ourselves, or we are the cause of persecution. Not at all. Rather, persecution is the strange and disconcerting name that Levinas gives for an ethical demand that imposes itself upon us against our will. We are, despite ourselves, open to this imposition. And though it overrides our will, it shows us that the claims that others make upon us are part of our very sensibility, our receptivity, and our answerability. We are, in other words, called upon, And this is only possible because we are, in some sense, vulnerable to claims from others that we cannot anticipate in advance and for which there is no adequate preparation. For Levinas, there is no other way to understand the ethical reality. Ethical obligation depends upon our vulnerability to the claims of others, and it establishes us as creatures who are fundamentally defined by that ethical relation, the ways in which we are constantly interrupted by alterity, interrupted by the claims that others make upon us. This ethical relation is not a virtue that I have or exercise. It's not an attribute of my person. It's prior to any individual sense of self I might have. It's not as a discrete individual that any of us honor this ethical relation. I am already bound to you, and this is what it means to be the self that I am, receptive to you in ways that I cannot fully predict or control. This is also clearly the condition of my injurability as well, and in this way, my answerability and my injurability are bound up with one another. You may frighten me, even threaten me, but my obligation to you must still remain firm, right? So it's precisely from the sense of injurability that I am answerable to you. This relation precedes individuation. When I act ethically, I'm undone as a bounded being. I come apart. I find that I am my relation to the you whose life I seek to preserve, and without that relation, this I makes no sense. It's lost its mooring in this ethics that's always prior to the ontology of the ego. Another way to put this point is that the I becomes undone in its ethical relation to the you, which means that there is a very specific mode of being dispossessed that makes ethical relationality possible. If I possess myself too firmly or too rigidly, I cannot be in an ethical relation. The ethical relation means ceding a certain ego-logical perspective for one that is structured fundamentally by a mode of address. You call upon me, and I answer. But if I answer, it's only because I was already answerable. That is, this susceptibility and vulnerability constitutes me at the most fundamental level and is there, we might say, prior to any deliberate decision I might make to answer your call. In other words, one has to be already capable of receiving the call before actually answering it. In this sense, ethical responsibility presupposes ethical responsiveness. Now, most scholars would want to keep any consideration of Emmanuel Levinas separate from any analysis of Hannah Arendt. He's a philosopher of ethics, drawing on religious traditions, and emphasizes the ethical importance of passivity, receptivity. She was a social and political philosopher, adamantly secular, although some people argue that there are some messianic strains we can find in there. Arendt emphasizes time and again the political value of action, not receptivity, action. Why bring a discussion of Levinas together with one regarding Arendt? Both Levinas and Arendt take issue with the classically liberal conception of individualism. That is, the idea that individuals knowingly enter into certain contracts and their obligations follow from having deliberately and volitionally entered into agreements with one another. This view assumes that we are only responsible for those relations codified by agreements into which we've knowingly and volitionally entered. Arendt disputes this view. Indeed, it was the substance of the argument that she made against Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in the early 1960s. According to Arendt, Eichmann thought he could choose which populations should live and die. And in this sense, he thought he could choose with whom to cohabit the earth. What he failed to understand, according to Arendt, is that no one has the prerogative to choose with whom to cohabit the earth. We can choose in some ways how to live and where, and in local ways we can choose with whom to live, or perhaps in which neighborhood or city. But if we were to decide with whom to cohabit the earth, we would be deciding which portion of humanity may live and which may die. But if that choice is barred to us, that means that we are under an obligation to live with those who already live, who already exist, and any choice about who may or may not live is already a genocidal move, the beginning of a genocidal practice. And though we cannot dispute that genocide has happened and happens still, Arendt's point is that we are wrong to think freedom, in any ethical sense, is ever compatible with the freedom to commit genocide. The unchosen character of earthly cohabitation is, for Arendt, the condition of our very existence as ethical and political beings. Hence, to exercise the prerogative of genocide is to destroy not only the conditions of personhood constituted in the political sphere, but to destroy oneself as a person. This was one argument that Arendt made about why the death penalty was justified for Eichmann. He had already destroyed himself by not realizing that his own life was bound to those he destroyed, and that individual life makes no sense, has no reality outside of the social and political framework in which all lives are equally valued. So in Eichmann in Jerusalem, Arendt questioned the principles of justice used in the judging of Eichmann. And toward the end of her writings on the trial, in the epilogue, she explicitly claims that the reason why Eichmann must die is that he made the consequential error of thinking that he could choose with whom to cohabit the earth. What Eichmann and his superiors failed to realize was that the heterogeneity of the earth's population is an irreversible condition of social and political life. Our existence depends upon this heterogeneity, and there is no individuality outside of what Arendt called plurality. Arendt's accusation against Eichmann bespeaks a firm conviction that none of us may exercise such a prerogative, that those with whom we cohabit the earth are given to us prior to choice, and so prior to any social or political agreement we might enter through deliberation and volition. In fact, if we seek to make a choice where there is no choice, we are destroying the conditions of our own social and political life. In Eichmann's case, the effort to choose with whom to cohabit the earth was an explicit effort to annihilate some part of the earthly population: Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, communists, the disabled, and the ill, among others. And so the exercise of freedom upon which he insisted, Eichmann insisted, turned out to be equivalent to genocide. Arendt stands rather for this very plurality when she argues that none of us may choose with whom to cohabit the earth. We can choose with whom to share a household, perhaps also with whom to share a neighborhood, a region, where to draw the boundary of a state, but we're not in such instances deciding against the right to live for those who are outside of those lines of demarcation. But when people decide that they will not share the earth, that means that they're committed to eradicating a population from the face of the earth. Not only is this choice an attack on cohabitation as a precondition of political life, in Arendt's view, but it commits us to the following proposition. We must devise institutions and policies that actively preserve and affirm the non-chosen character of open-ended and plural cohabitation. Not only do we live with those we never chose, to whom we may feel no immediate sense of social belonging, but we're also obligated to preserve those lives and the open-ended plurality that is the global population. Now, I think Arendt would dispute some of my view. I think what she's offered, though, is an ethical view of cohabitation that serves as a guideline for particular forms of politics. In this sense, concrete political norms and policies emerge from the unchosen character of these modes of cohabitation. The necessity of cohabiting the earth is a principle that in her philosophy must guide the actions and policies of any neighborhood, community, or nation. The decision to live in one community or another is surely justified only as long as it does not imply that those who live outside the community lack the right to live. In other words, every communitarian ground for belonging is only justifiable on the condition that it is subordinate to a non-communitarian opposition to genocide. The way I read this, every inhabitant who belongs to a community belongs also to the earth, and this implies a commitment not only to every other inhabitant of the earth, but also, I think, a commitment to sustaining the earth such that every inhabitant can live a livable life. Interestingly enough, what got Arendt into so much trouble in Eichmann in Jerusalem is that she didn't just speak for the Jews. She spoke there and elsewhere for any and every other minority who could be or would be expelled from habitation on the earth by another group or by those in power. The one implies the other, and the speaking for every possible potential minority who could be subject to genocidal eradication, universalizes the principle of plurality. Right? She speaks universally, but what she's affirming is plurality. One reason Arendt refuses to separate the Jews from the other so-called nations persecuted by the Nazis is that she's arguing in the name of plurality, one that is coextensive with human life in any and all of its cultural forms. At the same time, her judgment of Eichmann is one that emerges precisely from an historical situation of a diasporic Jew who was herself a refugee from Nazi Germany, a diasporic Jew who also objected to the Israeli courts representing a specific nation only, when the crime, in her view, the Nazi crime, was a crime against humanity, and representing only the Jewish victims of the genocide, wasn't appropriate in her mind when there were so many other groups annihilated and displaced in accord with the Nazi policy formulated and implemented by Eichmann and his cohorts. And indeed, when she discusses this, she asks, on what grounds are we indicting Eichmann? We have to find grounds that would protect any and all minorities. In other words, we must understand his crime as a crime against humanity, even though it takes this specific historical form. If the judgment against Eichmann is to prove to be a useful precedent for crimes against humanity of this kind, it must be formulated at a general enough level to be applicable to anyone who may be a victim of genocide. This same notion of unchosen cohabitation not only implied the irreversibly plural or heterogeneous character of the Earth's population and an obligation to safeguard that plurality, but also a commitment to an equal right to inhabit the Earth, a commitment, therefore, to equality as well. These two dimensions of her argument took specific historical form in her argument against the idea of Israel as a state based on principles of Jewish sovereignty. She argued, as you may know, for a federated Palestine in the late 1940s and against Ben-Gurion's proposal to establish Israel on principles of Jewish sovereignty. The political conception of plurality for which she fought was implicit in the American Revolution, in her view, and it led her to refuse to accept exclusively national, racial, or religious grounds for citizenship. Indeed, she objected to the founding of any state that required the expulsion of some number of its inhabitants, the production of a new refugee class, especially when such a state invoked the rights of refugees to legitimate its founding. Under Nazi Germany, and again with the establishment of the State of Israel, Arendt's concern was with the right of refugees, those who are covered by no existing law and who belong to no existing nation state. In her terms, everyone has a right to belong to a place. That right belongs to everyone regardless of the place to which they belong. No existing modes of belonging ground or justify that right, for the right must belong to those who have no place and those who seek to lay claim to a place that is not yet theirs or that has been forcibly taken away. In other words, no specific communitarian mode of belonging grounds the right to belong. The right to belong is more fundamental than any particular community to which one belongs. And if we are to understand her argument against Eichmann, it appears that belonging must actually know no bounds and exceed every particular nationalist and communitarian limit. Both the arguments against genocide and the arguments for the rights of the stateless depend upon underscoring the limits of communitarian belonging. The plural or diverse population to which she refers is one that she understood Eichmann to deny, to destroy. And so also do all forms of the nation state, in her view, that seek to maintain a homogeneous national character. It became important for Arendt to argue after the Second World War that political life must be understood as always plural, multilingual. Reading her now, we have to ask how this plurality might still be affirmed under conditions where borders establish intractable and antagonistic forms of adjacency, or when global distances, both geographical and cultural, make the affirmation of ties more difficult. In my view, Arendt's normative views still hold. There is no one part of the population that can claim the earth for itself. No community or nation state or regional unit, no clan, no party, no race. And as I've suggested, to make such a claim that one group does own the earth is to enter into a policy of genocide. This means that unwilled proximity and unchosen cohabitation are preconditions of political life, the basis of her critique of nationalism, and they imply the obligation to live on the earth and in a polity that establishes modes of equality for a necessarily and irreversibly heterogeneous population. Indeed, unwilled proximity and unchosen cohabitation serve as the basis of our obligations not to destroy any part of the human population and to outlaw genocide as a crime against humanity, but also to invest institutions with the ethical demand to make all lives equally livable. Thus, from unchosen cohabitation, Arendt derives notions of universality and equality that commit us to institutions that seek to sustain human lives without regarding some part of the population as, in principle, unsustainable, socially dead, redundant, or intrinsically unworthy of life and protection, and therefore ungrievable. Of course, Arendt's views on the state of Israel were scandalous at the time, but actually it seems to me that the very notion of plurality that she articulated against Eichmann was one that she proposed for a federated government in Palestine, Israel at the time. What is evident is that her views on cohabitation, federated authority, equality and universality were in stark contrast to those who were defending nationalist forms of Jewish sovereignty, differential classifications for Jewish and non-Jewish citizens of the State of Israel, military policies to uproot Palestinians from their lands, and efforts to establish a Jewish demographic majority for the State of Israel. Although it's so often taught that Israel became an historical and ethical necessity for the Jews during and after the Nazi genocide, and that anyone who questions the founding principles of the Jewish state shows an extraordinary insensitivity to the plight of the Jews, it's important to remember that there were Jewish thinkers and political activists at the time, including Arendt, Martin Buber, Hans Kohn, and Judah Magnus, who thought that among the most important lessons of the Holocaust was an opposition to illegitimate state violence and to any state formation that sought to give electoral priority and citizenship to one race or religion, and that nation states ought to be internationally barred from dispossessing whole populations who fail to fit the purified idea of the nation. For some Jewish refugees who never again wished to see the dispossession of populations in the name of national or religious purity, Zionism and its forms of military violence against indigenous Palestinian populations were not the legitimate answer to the pressing needs of Jewish refugees. In the Eichmann text, Arendt continues to have the stateless in mind, as she did when she considered the massive deportations from Europe in World War II, and when in 1948 she objected to Ben-Gurion's proposals for Jewish national sovereignty. In 1944 and in 1948, she predicted a new refugee problem, not merely one that would happen during the Nakba of 1948 to over 750,000 Palestinians, but one that would continue to happen as the State of Israel moved forward as a nation state on the model that she rejected and thought everyone should reject as well. She could not have predicted the 1.4 million who now have that refugee status within the West Bank and Gaza alone, not even including those who are in exile, but she did predict that nation states that seek to regulate the racial or religious composition of their populations invariably produce new classes of refugees, and they call into question their own legitimacy by expelling populations who do not conform to the national norm. Her call for cohabitation was meant quite clearly to counter not only the genocidal politics of National Socialism, but the recurrent production of the stateless by any and all nations that seek to purge themselves of heterogeneity. And though she would have never argued that Israel is like Nazi Germany, and she would have rejected the analogy, and I propose that we all reject the analogy, she was clear that Israel was continuing a project of settler colonialism in the name of a national liberation project, producing hundreds of thousands of refugees that would not only delegitimate any claims to democracy made by that state, but it would keep that state embroiled in conflict for decades to come. 1944, in conflict for decades to come. For those who extrapolated principles of justice from the historical experience of internment and dispossession, the political aim was to extend equality regardless of cultural background or formation across languages and religions to those none of us ever chose or did not recognize that we had chosen, and with whom we have an enduring obligation to find a way to live. For whoever we are also those who were never chosen, who emerge on this earth without everyone's consent, and who belong from the start to a wider population and a sustainable earth. And this condition, paradoxically, yields the radical potential for new modes of sociality and politics beyond the avid and wretched bonds formed through settler colonialism and expulsion. We are all, in this sense, the unchosen people, but we are nevertheless unchosen together. It's not uninteresting to note that Arendt, herself a Jew and a refugee, understood her obligation not to belong to the chosen people, but rather to the unchosen, and to make mixed community precisely among those whose existence implies a right to exist and to lead a livable life. So I've offered you two perspectives derived in different ways from what we might call Jewishness. Levinas was himself a self-avowed Jewish thinker and Zionist, deriving his account of responsibility from an understanding of the commandments, how they act upon us, how they compel us to act ethically. And Arendt, though surely not religious in any conventional sense, nevertheless took her position as a Jewish refugee from the Second World War as a point of departure for thinking about genocide and statelessness, and for the plural conditions of political life. Of course, neither of them are easy to work with in a struggle such as mine. As with Levinas, there are parts of Arendt's position that are clearly racist. She objected, for instance, to Arab Jews, identified as a European, and thought others should as well. And yet some of what she writes is still a resource for thinking about the current global obligations to oppose and resist genocide, the reproduction of stateless populations, and the importance of struggling for a plural and open-ended conception of social and political life. Arendt's Euro-American framework was limited, yet another limitation comes to mind if we try to understand the relationship of precarity to practices of cohabitation. I want to suggest that precarity only makes sense if we're able to identify as clearly political issues: bodily dependency and need, hunger, and the need for shelter, vulnerability to injury and destruction, forms of social trust that let us live and thrive, I would say embodied forms of social trust, and the passions that are linked to our very persistence. If Arendt thought that such matters had to be relegated to the private realm, Levinas understood the importance of vulnerability to ethics, although he failed really to link vulnerability to a politics of the body. Although Levinas seems to presuppose a body impinged upon, he doesn't give it an explicit place in his ethical philosophy. And though Arendt theorizes the problem of the body, of the located body, the speaking body that emerges into the space of appearance as part of any account of political action, she's not quite willing to affirm a politics that struggles to overcome inequalities in food distribution, that affirms rights of housing, which targets inequalities in the sphere of reproductive labor. In my view, ethical claims emerge from bodily life itself, a bodily life that is not always unambiguously human. After all, the life that is worth preserving and safeguarding, the life that should be protected from murder, in Levinas's sense, or genocide in Arendt's sense, is connected to and dependent upon non-human life in essential ways. This follows from the idea of the human animal, and it's a different point of departure for thinking about politics. If we try to understand in concrete terms what it means to commit ourselves to preserving the life of the other, we are invariably confronted with the bodily conditions of life, and so a commitment not only to the other's corporeal persistence, but to all the environmental conditions that make corporeal persistence possible. In the so-called private sphere delineated in Arendt's The Human Condition, we find the question of needs, the reproduction of the material conditions of life, the problem of transience, of death itself, everything that pertains to precarious life. We find it all, but we find it in the private domain, not the public domain. The possibility of whole populations being annihilated either through genocidal policies or systemic negligence follows not only from the fact that there are those who believe they can decide among whom they will inhabit the earth, but also because such thinking presupposes a disavowal of an irreducible fact of politics, the vulnerability to destruction by others that follows from a condition of precarity in all modes of political and social interdependency. So even if we were to take Arendt seriously, that we must oppose genocide, we must understand that what makes us vulnerable to genocide is the fact that we are living beings who are vulnerable to destruction by others. We can make this into an existential claim: oh, everyone is precarious, and this follows from our social existence as bodily beings who depend upon one another for shelter and sustenance, and who are therefore at risk of homelessness, hunger, statelessness, destitution under unjust and unequal political conditions. And I am making that claim, but what I want to say is that I'm also making a slightly different claim, which is that our precarity is to a large extent dependent upon the organization of economic and social relationships, the presence or absence of sustaining infrastructures and social and political institutions. In this sense, precarity is indissociable from that dimension of politics that addresses the organization and protection of bodily needs. Precarity exposes our sociality, the fragile and necessary dimensions of our interdependency. And in this sense, it is from precarity that certain ethical obligations emerge. Whether explicitly stated or not, every political effort to manage populations involves a tactical distribution of precarity, more often than not articulated through an unequal distribution of precarity, one that depends on dominant norms regarding whose life is grievable, worth protecting, whose life is ungrievable, or marginally or episodically grievable, and so in that sense already lost in part or in whole, and thus less worthy of protection and sustenance. A different social ontology would have to start from a shared condition of precarity in order to refute those normative operations, pervasively racist, that decide in advance Who counts as human and who does not? Who has a right to cohabit the earth? Who does not? My point is not so much to rehabilitate humanism, but rather to struggle for a conception of ethical obligation that is grounded in precarity. No one escapes the precarious feature of social life, and we cannot understand cohabitation without understanding that a generalized precarity obligates us to oppose genocide and to sustain life on egalitarian terms. Perhaps this feature of our lives can serve as the basis for the rights of protection against genocide, whether through deliberate or negligent means. After all, even though our interdependency constitutes us as more than thinking beings, even as more than acting beings, indeed as social, as embodied, as vulnerable and passionate, our thinking gets nowhere without the presupposition of an interdependent, passionate, and sustaining condition of life. It is, of course, one thing to claim this in the abstract, and quite another to understand what the difficulties are in struggling for social and political forms that are committed to fostering sustainable interdependency on egalitarian grounds. When any of us are affected by the sufferings of others, we recognize and affirm an interconnection with them, even when we do not know their names or speak their language. At its best, some media representations of suffering at a distance compel us to give up our more narrow communitarian ties, to respond, sometimes in spite of ourselves, sometimes even against our will, to a perceived injustice. Such presentations can bring the fate of others near or make them seem very far away, and yet the kind of ethical demands that emerge through the media in these times depend upon this reversibility of proximity and distance. I tried to suggest at the beginning of my talk that certain bonds are actually wrought through this very reversibility. I want to suggest as well that we might find ways of understanding interdependency that characterize cohabitation precisely as these kinds of reversible bonds. I want to, of course, say that sometimes these bonds are wretched. One population is up against another in ways that feel unlivable. Modes of interdependency are exploitative or colonizing. This is surely the case in Israel-Palestine, where the notions of a national home and homeland are inevitably implicated in relations of internal heterogeneity and adjacency, which bring up the issue of unchosen cohabitation in yet another way. As you know, Israel and Palestine are joined. They overlap. And through the settlements and the military presence, Israel invades and pervades Palestinian lands. Even if these two entities sought a full-scale separation from each other, the two would still be bound to one another by the separation wall, by the border, by the military powers that control the border. The relationship would only be extended in its wretched form. It would not be broken. There are settlements now in the West Bank populated by right-wing Israelis who nevertheless depend on local Palestinians for conveying food or menial jobs. And we might point out as well that the soldiers at the checkpoint are in constant contact with Palestinians who are waiting there or passing through. These are wretched forms of binationalism. These are forms of contact, adjacency, unwilled modes of cohabitation that are not only clearly inegalitarian, but where the military presence is hostile, threatening, destructive. These are clearly different from the activist and weekly demonstrations at Bilin, where many have suffered physical injury and death, the important triumph at Budris to steer the wall away from the olive trees, the persistent rallying of support in Sheikh Jarrah every Friday for those threatened with the confiscation of their homes and those whose homes have already been transferred to Jewish Israelis, the important engagement with Ta'ayush, Arabic for living together during the Second Intifada, when medical supplies were illegally transported into the West Bank, the Israeli feminist activism of Mahsam Watch at the checkpoints dedicated to witnessing, chronicling, and opposing harassment and intimidation of Palestinians, or the work of Palestinian and Jewish Israelis together at Adalah in Haifa, an organization surely worthy of receiving the Nobel, which has legally processed thousands of claims against Israel for the confiscation of Palestinian lands and the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes. I would include among these the boycott, divestment, and sanction movements, which now has an Israeli version, which stipulates that coexistence requires equality and cannot take place under conditions where one party is subjected to colonial subjugation and disenfranchisement. It is an Arendtian view, to be sure. These are but a few of the many insistent and important ways of practicing and thinking about cohabitation, alliance, modes of working together, sometimes working in separate venues against the illegal occupation and for dignity and self-determination. Over and against these instances of cohabitation, there are, we know, antagonistic ties, what I've been calling wretched bonds, raging and mournful modes of connectedness. In those cases where living with others on adjacent lands or uncontested or colonized lands produces aggression and hostility in the midst of that cohabitation. Colonial subjugation and occupation is surely one way to live without choice next to and under a colonizing population. The mode of unchosen cohabitation that belongs to the colonized is surely not the same as the notion of a democratic plurality established on grounds of equality. And this is why only those forms of alliance that struggle to overcome colonial subjugation carry the trace of any future possibility of cohabitation between the inhabitants of that piece of earth. Otherwise, Palestinians remain disproportionately exposed to precarity, and Israelis act to shore up their territory and majority rule through extending colonial control and heightening their modes of military aggression. I want to argue in closing that even in situations of antagonistic and unchosen conditions of cohabitation, certain ethical obligations emerge. Since we do not choose with whom to cohabit the earth, we have to honor those obligations to preserve the lives of those we may not love, we may never love, who we do not know and did not choose. These obligations emerge from the social conditions of political life, from precarity and proximity, not from any agreement we've made, nor from any deliberate choice. These very social conditions of livable life are precisely those that have to be achieved or struggled for. We cannot rely on them as presuppositions that will guarantee our good life together. On the contrary, they supply the ideals toward which we must struggle. Because we're bound to realize these conditions, we are also bound to one another in passionate and fearful alliance, sometimes despite ourselves, but ultimately for ourselves, that is, for a we who is plural and constantly in the making. These conditions imply equality, but also an exposure to precarity. Equality I take from Ared, precarity here from Levinas. And this leads us, I think, to understand as a global obligation imposed upon us the task of finding political and economic forms that minimize precarity and establish economic political equality. Those forms of cohabitation characterized by equality and minimized precarity become the goal to be achieved by any struggle against subjugation and exploitation. They are also the goals that start to be achieved in the practices of alliance or cohabitation or ta'ayush that assemble across distances to achieve those very goals. We struggle in, from, and against precarity, and it is not only from pervasive love for humanity or a pure desire for peace that we strive to live together. We live together because we have no other choice, and yet we must struggle to affirm the ultimate value of that unchosen social world. That struggle makes itself known and felt precisely when we exercise freedom in a way that is necessarily committed to the equal value of lives. We can be alive or dead to the suffering of others. They can be dead or alive to us depending on how they appear and whether they appear at all. But only when we understand that what happens there also happens here, and that here is already an elsewhere, and necessarily so, do we stand a chance of grasping the difficult and shifting global obligations in which we live, which make our lives possible, and sometimes too often impossible. Thank you very much.